This is my story. My whole life, I worked for my son, Ryan. I gave him everything I never had: a decent education, a safe roof over his head, a path cleared of thorns. I built his world with these two hands, believing my sacrifice was an investment in his devotion. I thought he would respect me in my old age, that he'd care for me the way I had spent my youth caring for him. But one night, in the very house I'd bought, at the very dinner table I'd built, all I asked for was a little more mashed potatoes. And he didn't just say no. He threw a glass of ice water in my face. I didn't fight back. Not a single yell, not an angry gesture. I just stood up, walked into my room, and started to plan. You won't believe what I did next. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Memory isn't a straight road. It's a labyrinth, and sometimes all it takes is a soft breeze off the Florida coast to send you right back to the beginning. For me, the beginning was always Pittsburgh. Before Sarasota and this manufactured peace, there was Pittsburgh and its raw, naked truth. The sky there wasn't blue. It was the color of smoke, of coal, of dreams ground to dust beneath the wheels of industry. The air was thick with the smell of smelted metal and the sweat of men like me. I wasn't born into wealth. My childhood was simply a state of existence, working from the time I was 12. I remember the brutal winters, the cold seeping through my thin coat, my hands numb as I hauled frozen bricks on a construction site. I remember the smell of grease and the ceaseless roar of machinery at the U.S. steel plant where I gave 40 years of my life. It was a world where every day was a battle, and your paycheck wasn't a reward. It was ammunition for the next day's fight. My philosophy was forged in that furnace. Every coin I earned, every dollar I carefully tucked away, was never for me. My colleagues might hit the bars after a shift, throwing their money at pitchers of beer and fleeting moments of joy. I went home. I'd look at my calloused hands and see that they weren't just building steel bridges. They were building a future where my son would never know the taste of coal dust in his throat. The day Ryan was born, the sun was shining in Pittsburgh. Or at least, that's how I remember it. I stood in the hospital room, looking out the window where the smokestack still reached for the sky. But for the first time, they held no menace. They were just a faded backdrop to the tiny, perfect infant in the bassinet. My wife was exhausted but smiling, and I just stood there, silenced by the moment. I looked at my own hands, the thick, rough fingers, worn down by labor, and compared them to his tiny, grasping ones. In that instant, a promise was made, not with words, but with the entire force of my soul. He will never live the life I lived. That promise became my religion. It was why I took the extra night shifts, why I ignored the chronic ache in my back, why I refused to buy myself a new coat so I could afford Ryan's textbooks. I watched him grow step by step, and every one of his achievements was a validation of my sacrifice. His high school diploma was framed and hung in the most prominent place in our home. The day he got into college, I felt more pride than the day I was promoted to foreman. I used my entire retirement savings to buy him his first Acura TLX because Hank Miller's son wasn't going to drive some beat-up clunker. And then I bought the house. A sturdy craftsman bungalow in the suburb of Mount Lebanon, with a backyard for the grandkids I hoped would one day come. I signed my name on the deed. This is the safest way, I told myself. A legacy for the future, an anchor for him in case life's storms start to rage. I never imagined that I would one day be the one to pull that anchor up. Ryan and Ashley's wedding was the grand crescendo. I paid for everything, from her dress to the lavish reception. I watched my son, handsome in his tuxedo, standing beside his beautiful wife, and I thought, it's done. My work is finished. I had given him everything: an education, a car, a home, a family. I had given him the life I had only dared to dream of. I naively believed that now, as I grew old and frail, It would be his turn to take care of me. An investment. It turns out I had spent my life investing in a castle made of sand, a beautiful fortress that was about to be washed away by a single glass of cold water. A father's promise made over a cradle isn't a contract written in ink. It's carved into his bones, sealed with sweat and sleepless nights. My promise to Ryan became the lighthouse that guided every decision I made for the next 30 years. And I followed that light blindly, never realizing it was leading me straight into a hurricane. I wanted him to have an education, to grow up safe. Basic things. But to me, they were luxuries. To make them a reality for Ryan, I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. By day, I was a foreman at the steel mill, breathing in air thick with the taste of metal. At night, when other men went home to their families, I'd put on a security guard's uniform and patrol cold, empty office buildings. Sleep became a debt I could never repay. There were weeks I survived on black coffee and cold sandwiches. I skipped meals to make sure he ate well, to scrape together every dollar for his college fund. I'd see my own body wearing down in the mirror, but then I'd look at the picture of Ryan on the wall and know the sacrifice was worth it. The day he got his college acceptance letter, I cried. It was the first time I'd cried since my mother passed away. A steelworker's tears don't come easy, but they carried the weight of 1,000 night shifts and 1,000,000 dull aches in my back. I watched with pride as he walked across the stage in his cap and gown. He looked so poised, his future stretching out before him. He waved at me from the stage, and in that moment, I felt like a king watching his prince ascend to the throne. I thought the hardship was finally over. But a father's love is a slippery slope. Once you provide the needs, you start thinking about the wants. Ryan graduated and got a good job, but he needed a car. Hank Miller's son can't be taking the bus, I told myself. I withdrew a huge chunk of my retirement savings, money I'd earmarked for fishing trips and a little travel, and bought him a gently used Acura TLX. It was sleek, impressive. The day I handed him the keys, he threw his arms around me. "Thanks, Dad, you're the best," he'd said. I believed him. I didn't realize that was the moment the bricks of gratitude started to loosen. And then came Ashley, a beautiful, smart girl. Ryan wanted to get married, to start a family. He needed a house. Again, I told myself, Hank Miller's son needs a decent roof over his wife and kids. I drained what was left of my savings, took out one last mortgage, and bought the Craftsman bungalow in Mount Lebanon. A solid house with a yard where my future grandchildren could play. The day we signed the papers, the lawyer asked whose name should be on the deed. I didn't hesitate for a second. "Henry Miller," I said. "Mine alone." I explained to Ryan that it was the safest way, a precaution. "This is our family legacy," I told him. "It'll all be yours one day, but for now, let me hold on to it. Think of it as an anchor in case life's storms get rough." Ryan nodded, too overjoyed with his new house to think twice. That was the forgotten truth. Everything was in my name. I thought it was the safest way, a legacy for the future. I never imagined that very safety would become my ultimate weapon. The wedding was the final chapter in my symphony of sacrifice. I stood in the corner, smiling with satisfaction as I watched them dance. My job was done. I had given my son everything. But then, things started to change. Ryan grew dissatisfied with his job. He wanted to get rich quick. He started talking about things I didn't understand: cryptocurrency, Dogecoin, going to the moon. He poured all of his and Ashley's savings into it. And then, the bubble burst. Ryan lost everything. His confidence evaporated, replaced by a bitter, simmering resentment. My house was no longer their home. It became a constant reminder of his failure. And I, once the revered patriarch, became a burden in his eyes. Ashley's silence was a terrifying agreement. Ryan's sighs whenever I asked for the smallest thing became more frequent. The castle I had built was crumbling, and I had no idea its foundations had been rotting all along. I didn't understand crypto. To a man who'd spent his life trading sweat for real, tangible dollars you could hold in your hand, the idea of a currency that existed only in the air was absurd. But Ryan was a believer. He spoke of the blockchain, of going to the moon, of overnight millionaires. He spoke with a fervor I hadn't seen in him even when he graduated from college. His eyes would light up, and he was constantly checking his phone, smiling at the green numbers dancing on the screen. For a few weeks, the atmosphere in the house was strange. Ryan was happier, more generous. He'd clap me on the shoulder and say, "See, Dad? This is the future, not 12-hour shifts at the mill." Ashley seemed relieved, too, the tension leaving her smile. I tried to be happy for them, though a part of me felt a deep unease. It was the feeling you get standing on an old steel bridge when you hear a faint creak from below. And then, the bridge snapped. I wasn't there when it happened. I was in the backyard, trying to fix a leaning fence post. But I heard the noise. A choked-off scream, followed by a loud thump like someone had punched a wall. I hurried inside. The scene in the living room will be burned into my memory forever. Ryan was sitting in front of his computer, still as a statue. Only his shoulders were trembling. On the screen was a red line, plunging downward like a sheer cliff face. His expression was a horrifying mix of frantic hope and dawning, brutal reality. He kept refreshing the page, as if the act itself could reverse destiny. Ashley stood in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth. She whispered, her voice cracking, "Ryan? What's happening?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared at the screen. "Ryan, say something!" Ashley stepped forward, her voice rising. "Our savings?" Finally, Ryan moved. He turned to his wife, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Pure, undiluted hatred. It wasn't disappointment. It was the rage of a dethroned king. "It's just a correction," he snarled, his voice raspy. "It'll bounce back. You don't understand any of this." "A correction?" Ashley's voice broke into a sob. "Ryan, our entire nest egg, the house payments, money for a baby. I told you not to." "Not to what?" Ryan shot up from his chair, sending it flying backward. "Not to try and have a better life? Not to try and get out from under his shadow?" He jabbed a finger in my direction, where I stood frozen in the hallway. "Or what? You wanted me to work 40 years in a steel mill, collect a pathetic pension, and die quietly like him?" Then he said the words that drove the final nail into the coffin of respect. He was looking at Ashley, but his words were aimed straight at me. If he'd had a little more vision, things would be different. If he'd given me a real start, instead of just throwing me the damn scraps from his table, we wouldn't be in this mess. Scraps. That's what he called 40 years of my labor. The car, the house, the education. All of it was just scraps. From that day on, my house was no longer a home. It became a prison of silence and resentment. Ryan started to look at me like I was the living embodiment of his failure. The respect vanished completely, replaced by irritability and a heavy sigh every time I entered a room. He avoided my gaze. Every question I asked, no matter how small, was met with a clipped, one-word answer. I became a ghost in my own house. Ashley avoided me too, her silence a cold, impenetrable wall. I could feel her tension, the frustration of a woman forced to carry the consequences of her husband's mistakes. The castle I had built with my own sweat and blood was collapsing. The foundation had rotted long ago, and all it needed now was a slight breeze to blow it all away. I just didn't know that breeze was coming in the form of a glass of ice water. The silence in the Mount Lebanon house had become its own language. It had different shades. There was the heavy silence of unspoken accusations, the sharp silence of contempt, and the empty silence of a love that had died. That evening at dinner, all those shades of silence were present, gathered around the table like uninvited guests. We were having meatloaf and mashed potatoes, a meal of memories, from a time when laughter still existed in this kitchen. Ashley had made it, perhaps in a desperate attempt to recreate a peace that was long gone. But the warm food only highlighted the coldness between us. Ryan stabbed his fork into the meatloaf with a quiet violence, as if punishing it for some crime. Ashley just pushed the food around her plate. My young grandson, sensing the tension, ate with a timid quietness. I ate slowly, piece by piece. Every movement seemed too loud in the stillness. I wasn't hungry anymore, but I ate out of habit, the last remnant of a family order that had already collapsed. I looked at my son. His face was a mask of frustration, his eyes glued to his phone, where the red numbers were no doubt still taunting him. He hadn't spoken a kind word to me in weeks. And then, I did something. Something small, mundane, but in a minefield, even a falling pebble can trigger an explosion. I held out my plate, a humble gesture. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Ryan, could you pass the potatoes, please?" It wasn't about the potatoes. It was never about the potatoes. It was a test, a disguised, desperate question. I wanted to see if there was anything left of the man, of the son I had raised. Ryan looked up from his phone. He looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes. Anger is still an emotion, still has the warmth of a connection. His eyes were completely empty, as cold as a Pittsburgh winter. It was the look a stranger gives a bothersome panhandler on the street. He said nothing. He just stared, letting my request hang in the thick air, letting the silence twist it into something ugly and shameful. Time seemed to stop. I could hear the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the living room, each tick a hammer blow against my patience. Then he moved, slowly, deliberately. He set his fork down next to his plate. The small clink echoed in the quiet. Then he reached out, not for the bowl of mashed potatoes, but for his glass of water. And then he threw it in my face. The shock of the cold stole my breath. Ice cubes hit my forehead and clattered onto my plate. Water streamed down my face, into my wrinkles, into my mouth, down my collar. I just sat there, stunned and soaking wet. It wasn't water. It was humiliation. In that instant, I was no longer his father. I was just an inconvenience. Every sacrifice, every night shift, every drop of sweat, all of it was washed away by a glass of cold water. I looked around the table. Ashley's jaw had dropped, her eyes wide with horror. But only for a second. Almost immediately, she dropped her head and stared at her plate, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She had chosen her side. My little grandson was frozen, his fork suspended in midair, his innocent eyes staring at me, not understanding. No one spoke. No one stopped him. No one offered me a napkin. I was utterly and completely alone. A strange calm washed over me. Not anger, not grief, just a cold, crystalline clarity. I slowly reached for my paper napkin and began to wipe my face. My movements were slow, methodical. I wiped the water from my forehead, my cheeks, my chin. Then I set the sopping napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs on the hardwood floor the only sound to break the silence. I stood up. I didn't look at Ryan. I didn't look at Ashley. I didn't look at anyone. There was no point. They were just strangers sitting in my house. I turned and walked quietly to my room. I didn't hurry. I didn't drag my feet. Each step was steady. The door closed behind me, not with an angry slam, but with a soft, final click. That click was the end of a chapter of my life. My bedroom wasn't large. Just enough space for a bed, a dresser, and a worn armchair my wife had loved. The walls were painted a non-committal beige. For years, this room had been my sanctuary, a quiet space to read and reflect after a long day's work. But that night, after the click of the door, it became a command center. I sat on the edge of the bed, my clothes still damp. I didn't change. I wanted to feel the chill, to let it sink into my bones as a reminder. I didn't cry. Tears belonged to a world of hurt and hope, and I was no longer in that world. I didn't feel anger either. Anger is a hot fire, and all I felt inside was an icy stillness. Humiliation does a strange thing to a man. It can either break him, or it can forge his spine out of steel. When that water hit my face, it extinguished the last flickering ember of sentimental weakness. The unconditionally loving father died at that dinner table. All that was left was Henry Miller, the man who had built everything in this house. I got up and walked to the corner of the room, to the old, heavy safe I'd bought 30 years ago. It was steel, ponderous, a relic from another time. Ryan used to joke about it, calling it Dad's rusty old box. He never knew what was inside, and he never cared enough to ask. He assumed it was just a few worthless old papers. He was wrong. I knelt, my calloused fingers working the combination dial. The familiar clicks echoed in the silence. Left, right, left. The safe swung open with a heavy thud. No tears, no rage, just a cold, methodical clarity. I pulled out a thick file, bound neatly with string. I took it to the bed and spread the contents under the lamplight. These weren't just papers. This was my life. This was the truth. The first document I picked up was the deed to the house. The print was clear. Owner, Henry Hank Miller. My name, and my name alone. I remembered the day I signed it, my hands still smudged with grease from the mill. I had felt like a king taking possession of his kingdom. Ryan and Ashley lived in this kingdom, ate its food, slept under its roof, but they had forgotten who wore the crown. Next was the PNC Bank Savings Passbook. The number at the bottom of the page was staggering, the result of 40 years of relentless work and frugal living. Ryan's name was on the account as a beneficiary, an arrangement I'd made long ago in case something happened to me. But I was the primary owner. The power was all mine. Finally, there were the investment portfolios. No trendy, high-risk gambles like Dogecoin. Just solid blue-chip stocks, boring mutual funds, things that grew slowly but surely, just like me. I sat there, surrounded by the irrefutable proof of my own power. A faint, humorless smile touched my lips. He had forgotten a simple truth. A truth he had taken so for granted he'd stopped seeing it altogether. All of this was mine. The house he was sleeping in, the bed he was lying on. The money he assumed would just automatically fund his lifestyle. It was all mine. My love had blinded him. My sacrifice had created a monster of entitlement. He thought I was the burden, a tiresome old man living off his good graces. The truth was the exact opposite. He and his entire family were living off me. The plan began to form in my mind, not as an emotional storm, but as an architectural blueprint. Clear, precise, and cold. Step 1. The bank. Tomorrow I would go to the PNC branch. I would have Ryan's name removed from the account and transfer the entire sum to a new one he could never touch. Step 2. The house. I would call a real estate agent. I would sell it. I didn't care about the price. I just needed it done quickly and cleanly. Step 3. The future. I would disappear. I would take my money and go somewhere warm. Florida, Sarasota maybe, where there was an ocean and sun, where no one knew my name, where I wasn't anybody's father. I would live the rest of my life for myself. I carefully gathered the papers, but I didn't put them back in the safe. I laid them neatly on the bedside table. They were no longer a legacy. They were weapons. That night, I slept. For the first time in months, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, because for the first time in years, I knew exactly what I had to do. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet click of a closing door and the silence of a perfectly executed plan. The dawn that followed didn't bring warmth. It was just a gray, cold streak across the Pittsburgh sky, a perfect match for the feeling in my chest. I woke not to an alarm, but to a sense of purpose. The plan had been forged in the night, and now it was time for the execution. The most important move had to be made first. I went to the law offices of Abrams and Associates. The place was a different world from mine. Polished wood floors, leather armchairs, and an air of quiet dignity. Mr. Abrams was a man about my age, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He listened to my story without interruption. When I was finished, I stated my terms. First, I said, placing my calloused hands on his mahogany desk, I want to redraft my will. I want Ryan Miller's name removed from it entirely. My entire estate, upon my death, is to be donated to a charity for orphaned children. Mr. Abrams nodded slowly. Second, I continued, I need you to oversee the sale of my house. Ensure that every step is legal and cannot be contested. When the sale is final, have all the necessary paperwork ready. I handed him the deed. He examined it, then looked up at me. Hank, these are very final actions. Once this is done, there's no going back. I know, I said. That's the point. Immediately after leaving the lawyer's office, I set the next step in motion. I waited until Ryan and Ashley had left for the day, then picked up the old landline phone. A voice on the other end answered, Howard Hanna Real Estate, how can I help you? Hello, I said. I own a house in Mount Lebanon. I want to sell it. Yes, sir. We can send an agent out to... I cut her off. I don't need the highest valuation. I need a fast sale, as fast as possible. I will accept a reasonable offer for an immediate all-cash closing. There was a pause on the other end. My urgency was unusual. Sir, are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I replied. The next few days passed in a quiet, tense flurry of activity. Real estate agents came by while Ryan and Ashley were at work. I arranged it all discreetly. They measured. They took photos. They brought by potential buyers. I faced my son and daughter-in-law every evening, maintaining a placid exterior while the ground was literally being sold out from under them. A few weeks later, a cash offer came through. The deal was closed swiftly under Mr. Abrams' supervision. I had lived in that house for nearly 40 years. But on that final morning, it was just a shell. I woke before sunrise. Ryan and Ashley were still asleep in their room, oblivious, their world about to come crashing down. I didn't take much. An old suitcase, a few changes of clothes, the book from my nightstand, and a single photograph in a silver frame. My wife, the woman who had helped me build all of this, who would never have believed this story. I left everything else. The furniture, the mementos, the ghosts of a family that once was. Before I left, I placed a lawyer-prepared envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was the official notice of the sale of the property and a copy of the new will. My actions were my goodbye. I walked out the front door for the last time, but I didn't go straight to the airport. There was one final piece of business. I took the bus downtown. The PNC Bank Tower stood tall, a monument to power and money. I walked in, a small old man in a worn coat, and waited patiently in line. When it was my turn, I was directed to an advisor's desk. She smiled and asked how she could help. I placed my documents on her desk. I'm Henry Miller, I said, my voice even. I want to remove Ryan Miller's name from this savings account. And I want to transfer the entire balance to a new individual account, in my name only. Her smile faltered slightly. Mr. Miller, This is a joint account with a considerable balance. Are you certain about this decision? I am certain, I replied, my face a mask of stone. She didn't ask any more questions. She just printed out a stack of forms. I read every word, then signed on every empty line. My hand didn't shake. Each signature was a final hammer blow, shattering the invisible chains that had bound me. Nearly an hour later, I walked out of the bank. In my pocket was the information for a new account. Henry Miller's account. Henry Miller's alone. It was done. This time, I walked to the bus stop just as I had for thousands of other mornings. But I wasn't heading to the mill. I was heading to the airport. At Pittsburgh International, I looked up at the departure board. The flight to Sarasota, Florida was boarding. I walked toward the gate, my old suitcase rolling behind me. With every step, the weight of 40 years felt like it was dissolving. I wasn't a father anymore. I wasn't a landlord. I was just Hank. And for the first time in my life, I was about to start living for me. I sat on the balcony of my new apartment in Sarasota, a glass of iced tea sweating on the small table beside me. The salty humidity of the Gulf of Mexico hung in the air, and the gentle lapping of waves on the shore was a soothing rhythm, a world away from the loud, percussive clang of the Pittsburgh steel mills. It was the first Saturday afternoon of my new life, and I knew that, over 1,000 miles to the north, the first crack in the facade had just appeared. I didn't have to be there to see it. I could picture it perfectly because I had engineered it. I closed my eyes, and the Florida vista disappeared, replaced by the harsh fluorescent glare of a giant Eagle supermarket. Saturday was their grocery day. Ryan always liked to fill the cart to overflowing, a performance of his false prosperity. I saw him, whistling, tossing thick-cut steaks, a bottle of California wine, and all manner of expensive snacks into the cart. He was living under the delusion that the supply was infinite, that my account was a bottomless well. Ashley would be beside him, perhaps enjoying the temporary comfort, unaware they were walking on thin ice. And then, the moment of truth. The checkout line. I pictured the tired-looking cashier scanning each item. The beep, beep, beep of the scanner, the total climbing on the screen, a number that had never concerned Ryan. Finally, the grand total was displayed. In my mind's eye, I saw Ryan pull out his wallet with a casual confidence. He produced the PNC debit card, the one he had used as if it were his own for years. He swiped it with a flourish. And then, instead of the familiar approving chime, there was another sound, a sharp, jarring buzz. On the small screen, red letters flashed. Transaction declined. I could see the frown crease Ryan's brow. His confidence would curdle into annoyance. Machine must be acting up, I could hear him say, a touch of condescension in his voice. He'd swipe it again. The same buzz, the same red letters, like a public accusation. A hush must have fallen over them. I pictured the man in line behind them sighing, Ashley looking at her husband with a mix of confusion and irritation. "What's wrong, Ryan?" she would ask. And Ryan, his face flushing with shame, would mutter some weak excuse about a system error. Dozens of strangers' eyes would be on him, judging the impotence of a man who couldn't pay for his own groceries. His pride, the very weapon he had wielded against me, was now melting under the supermarket lights. I saw him turn to Ashley, his voice a near whisper, swallowing his humiliation. "You pay for it with your card." That moment, for me, was more important than getting the money back. It was the moment Ryan first realized that the world did not, in fact, revolve around him. That actions have consequences. The public shame he felt at that checkout counter was just a small echo of the humiliation I had felt at the dinner table. He had thrown water in my face in front of our family. I had cut off his lifeblood in front of the world. I opened my eyes and looked out at the ocean. A pelican was gliding over the waves. Here, in Sarasota, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't glee. It wasn't joy. It was a sense of cold, precise justice. as exact as a machine I once operated. I knew they would have left the store in silence, tension filling their car. Ryan would be surly, blaming the bank, blaming anything but himself. But a seed of fear had been planted. A small, cold knot had formed in the pit of his stomach. And I, 1,000 miles away, knew it was only the beginning. The first crack had appeared. Soon, his entire sandcastle would wash away. I can see it as clearly as if I were watching an old film. The car ride home from the supermarket would have been drenched in a heavy silence, so different from the silence at the dinner table. That silence had been filled with contempt and power. This one reeked of shame and a nameless dread. Ashley would be at the wheel, her hands clenched, her eyes locked on the road. She wouldn't say a word, but the rigid set of her shoulders and the hard line of her jaw would say everything. She was furious, not just at my son, but at the public humiliation he had brought upon them. Ryan would be in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the familiar houses of Mount Lebanon slid by like ghosts. His weak excuse about a system glitch would still be hanging in the air between them, hollow and false. The moment Ashley killed the engine, he would have bolted from the car, not even bothering to help with the groceries. He had to prove he was right, that this was just some stupid technical error. I see him rushing to his small home office, turning on the computer with trembling fingers. The machine's startup chime would have seemed to last an eternity. He'd open the browser, type in the PNC Bank website, his heart starting to thud against his ribs. He'd enter his username and password, the familiar characters he'd typed 1,000 times. He'd hit enter. The page would load for a second, and then invalid username or password. What the hell? I can hear him muttering in my mind. He would type it again, slower this time, character by character. The same result. Annoyance would begin to rise, overriding the initial fear. He'd click the forgot password link, follow the verification steps. But when he entered his personal information, the system would return a cold, impersonal message. The information provided does not match any account in our system. The knot of ice in his stomach would begin to grow. Ashley would be standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Well?" she'd ask, her voice flat. "I'm handling it," he would snap. He'd grab his phone, dial the bank's customer service line. After an eternity on hold with grating music, a professional voice would come on the line. He'd state his problem, trying to keep his voice steady, but it would have a slight, reedy edge to it. The woman on the other end would ask for his personal information to verify his identity. He'd rattle off his name, address, date of birth, social security number. There would be a pause, filled only by the sound of her typing. "Sir?" she would say, her tone now cool and distant. "I'm not showing your name associated with any accounts at our institution." "What? That's ridiculous," he'd practically shout. "My name has been on that account for years. It's my account with my father, Henry Miller." "I understand your frustration, sir," she would reply in a tone trained to de-escalate angry customers. However, the records show that the primary account holder, Mr. Henry Miller, requested to have your name removed from the account several days ago. You no longer have any access. His ears would be ringing. Her words were like hammer blows. "Removed my name. At my father's request." This wasn't a system error. This was a deliberate act. Just then, the doorbell would ring. Ashley would go to answer it. He would be sitting frozen in his chair, the phone slipping from his grasp. He'd hear a polite male voice at the front door. Curiosity and a deep sense of foreboding would pull him to his feet. A man in a sharp suit holding a clipboard would be talking to Ashley. He'd offer a professional smile when he saw him. "Good afternoon," the man would say. "I'm Mark from Howard Hanna Real Estate. I'm just here to conduct the final walkthrough for the new owners." He would blink. "New owners? What are you talking about? This is my father's house." Mark's smile would become a little strained. He'd open his briefcase and pull out a sheaf of papers. "According to our records, Mr. Miller, this house was sold. The sale was finalized yesterday morning. I'm just here to complete some final paperwork." Ashley would be staring at him, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The paper in the man's hand was a death warrant. The house, the bank, all at once. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a calculated annihilation. His father hadn't just left. He had erased him. A wave of pure panic would wash over him, drowning all reason. He would push past the man and storm into my room. It would be eerily neat. The bed made, everything in its place. But it was empty, sterile, devoid of life. He'd frantically pull open drawers, throwing my old clothes onto the floor. He'd tear through the closet, staring at the empty spaces. Nothing. Not a note. Not a trace. And then, returning to the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs, he would see it. A single white envelope placed neatly on the dinner table, in the exact spot where I used to sit. His hands would be shaking as he picked it up. He'd rip it open. Inside, there was no letter, no emotional explanation, just two pieces of paper. The first was a printout of a new bank account statement. At the top, a single name, Henry Miller. Below it, an enormous number. The second was a formal letter from the law offices of Abrams and Associates. It coolly informed him of the successful sale of the Mount Lebanon property and included a summary of a revised last will and testament, from which the name Ryan Miller had been completely stricken. He would collapse to his knees. The papers would flutter to the floor. His entire world, everything he had assumed was his, had been taken from him with a few strokes of a pen. He'd grab his phone, his fumbling fingers dialing my number. It would ring once, then go straight to voicemail. He'd call again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. My silence was now more brutal than any scream. In Sarasota, my phone lay face down on my bedside table on silent mode. I did not hear the frantic calls from Pittsburgh. Even if I had, I would not have answered. I was walking along the beach where my new condo, Seaside Villas, was located. I let my bare feet sink into the cool, damp sand as the sun set, painting the Gulf of Mexico in strokes of fire. My lawyer had sent a brief email that morning. No frills, just a confirmation that all my instructions had been followed. The account was mine. The house was transferred. The will was sealed. My son had nothing left but his pride. And pride doesn't pay the grocery bill. Pride doesn't pay the rent. That was his punishment. My justice wasn't about shouting or fists. It was about silence, about paperwork, about a final clean severance. Justice for me was not about seeing him suffer. It was about knowing he could no longer control me, no longer humiliate me, no longer pretend he was the master of what I had built. He had used water to wash away my dignity in front of his family. I had used the stroke of a pen to wash away his future. I stopped walking and watched the white-capped waves roll gently to shore and retreat, erasing every footprint. Here, alone, I didn't feel lonely. I felt whole. The burden of 40 years of sacrifice, of unreciprocated expectation, was gone. Justice was knowing that for the rest of his life, every time he faced a financial struggle, every time he had to scrape by, his mind would return to that moment at the dinner table. He would remember the glass of water. He would remember my silence. And he would understand, far too late, that his father had never been powerless. In the end, he lost everything because he couldn't offer the smallest thing in return: respect. And I, here on this beach, was finally free. If you found this story compelling, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear our next story, click on the box on the left of your screen. Thank you for watching.